you are going to be reading about culture. Culture is one of those areas, probably the biggest area, where anthropology and sociology share a lot in common. Right? These are two disciplines that study how people do things, why they believe the things they do, the type of rituals or practices they engage in. It's where sociology and anthropology read each other's work, read the same theorists. So there's a ton of overlap here. So if you're interested in anthropology, you're going to see some things that look very familiar. Now, in studying culture, one of the things that both anthropologists do and sociologists do is they attempt to make the ordinary strange and also make the strange ordinary. This is what the supplemental reading this week is all about, and this is what we're going to focus on today in a very, very short lecture. All right, before we get into that, this is the time where you really should start thinking about, does this class make sense, right? Is there anything on the syllabus that's confusing? Is there anything about Blackboard that doesn't make sense? Am I having trouble with how to access the book, how to take the quizzes, the inquisitive software that's provided? Is there something about the semester and where we're going that's confusing? Do I know where to submit the in-class writings? Is there something about me that you want to know or something that's not working? Great chance to check in with yourself and email me if that is the case, or set up a time to talk to me during office hours, or if office hours do not work for you, during another time. All right, let's get back into it. So in the 50s, there was an anthropologist known as Horace Mitchell Minor, and he was at the University of Minnesota. He was the head of the American Anthropological Association, so very well-respected anthropologist. And he looked around at how anthropologists did their research, and he had a fundamental critique. He saw a problem. Now, this problem was actually, I would say, worse in anthropology than it is in sociology, but we can learn a lot from that error. And that's what this reading is about today. So in 1955, he wrote this article called The Body Ritual of the Nacirema. What I want you to do for the in-class writing this week is follow along these slides and make sure to do the reading and then answer the questions that I'm going to provide. So I'm going to help you out a little bit as I guide you through it, but I want you to pause. So do the reading, then start answering these questions, pause as you go along, and then start up again. So the first thing I want you to answer, the first question in class writing is, what would you say is the central focus of Nacirema ritual? So according to Minor, he's this anthropologist studying the group. What does he say is the central focus of their ritual, and what fundamental belief drives this? That's the first question. Second thing I want you to do, and this is the second question, is choose, let's just say one ritual instead. I wrote choose two rituals. Just choose one ritual that Minor discusses. So really what he does in this article is he supplies us with example after example of the type of practices or activities that people engage in the Nacirema group, and he describes them. So I want you to choose choose one of them. I want you to choose one of them and tell me, does it seem like he thinks it's a positive thing, right? This ritual that he describes, does it seem to make sense? Is it good? Would you recommend it for people to do the same thing? If he thinks it's positive, tell me why you think that. If you think he gives it a little bit of a negative connotation, what are his critiques? Second thing, in general, do the actions that he describes, the actions that the Nacirema engage in, do they seem rational or irrational? And then explain your answer. So that's the third question. Rational would mean they make sense. They're logical. They're the right thing to do. Irrational would say, probably not the best thing to do, doesn't make sense, you can't figure out why they did that, right? It's something, if someone acts in an irrational manner, they're probably acting in a way that you're judging negatively, and it's probably not the best way to get the outcome that you want. Doesn't make sense. So how do you think the Nacirema are described by Minor? Do their actions seem rational or irrational? All right. Pause the video if you need. I'm guessing you will need to. It's important to realize that the Nacirema, the group that Minor is describing, are Americans, right? So the Nacirema, if you even look at the spelling, it's American backwards. If you look at the geographic location that he points out, it's between the Caribbean, Mexico, and Canada. That's the United States. So what he's doing is he's imitating what anthropologists of that era would do, right? An anthropologist would leave the United States, or they would leave Western Europe, and they would go out into the world. They would leave their borders and go out into the world, and they would go to a place somewhere in the Amazon, or they would go to a remote village in Eastern Europe, or they would go to Ghana and go to an urban center in Ghana and describe how the people live, right? So he's saying, look at all these anthropologists going into the world and treating groups as they're strange, writing about them in a way that exaggerates the difference rather than really tries to understand who they are and why they do certain things. So what I want you to do, thinking for question 4, and I will point out, if you're reading this quickly, you probably wouldn't have realized that the Nacirema are the Americans. That varies every semester, how many people actually come to that realization. And you could see what Nacirema is doing is he's going through all these different things that Americans do during that time, whether it's going to the dentist, whether it's getting your hair done at a salon, whether it is being a model, whether it's getting surgery to augment parts of your body. Like at the end, he's talking about models who get surgery to increase the size of their breasts or to decrease the size of their breast, whether he's talking about what it's like to go to the hospital, what it's like to have a medicine cabinet. He's doing all those things like he's an alien, like he's an anthropologist arriving somewhere else and having no idea what people are doing or why they do it. So the first thing I want you to really think about is, what does this article teach us about studying other cultures? In other words, how can we avoid presenting cultures outside of our own as being strange, as being foreign, in the same way that Miner does with the Nacirema? So reflect on that, write a sentence or two. And then the next question you have to ask yourself, so the first part is, how do we avoid categorizing other people in a negative light just because they're different? The next question we have to ask ourselves, does this actually reveal something important about our own culture, right? Was he onto something? By treating rituals that we engage in, by treating things that we see as ordinary as being strange, does it actually reveal some sort of truths that hold up? Can we be more critical of ourselves when we don't realize that it's ourselves that we're being critical of, right? So think about that. That's question 4 and 5. 4, how do we avoid presenting other cultures in this negative light immediately? And then 5, what does that reveal about ourselves in doing it in this way? This is all around these concepts of cultural ethnocentrism and relativism, which is going to be brought up and defined in the textbook. But ethnocentrism is basically just saying, I'm going to judge other cultures against my own. My culture does things the correct way. The further you deviate from the way I do it, the lesser that you are, right? The more removed you are, the lesser that you are, the more strange, the more wrong you are. Relativism is saying, let's view cultures from their own perspective. It doesn't mean you have to celebrate everything a group does, right? Cultural relativism doesn't mean if I go to and I'm examining another group or culture and they engage in this activity that involves, let's say make a culture and they're engaged in like the just most awful, cruel acts towards children. You don't have to celebrate that, right? But what you can say is, let's understand this act from the perspective of that group. What is the history that led to this? How do people themselves make sense of the action they're engaging in? You can still critique a group, but it's not as saying, well, they're different than us, so it must be bad. All right, and then the final question. This is the most important one. Miner wrote this in 1955. That's over 50 years old. What would you write about to update it? So what I mean is Miner simply listed a series of activities or actions that Americans engage in and then described it as an anthropologist would. Imagine you're that anthropologist arriving in the United States today. What would you focus on? Things have changed a bit. Things have accelerated. Things have become more exaggerated. What would you focus on? How would you describe that topic? And what type of details would you emphasize? Now, you have two choices. You could simply write a paragraph, imagining you're doing the same thing as Miner, write a paragraph on an activity that Americans engage in and present it in a strange way. Or you could simply tell me how you would go about writing that essay, whichever seems more natural or easier to you. All right, so that is in-class writing for the week. That is the only thing you have to do for culture, along with the quiz at the end of the chapter. And I will see you next week. when we move on to, I believe, methods.